Welcome to our program. I'm Don Carleton, the Executive Director of the Dolph Briscoe Center for American History here at the University of Texas at Austin. The Briscoe Center recently published this book, Making Waves, which is edited by journalist and activist Thorne Dreyer, who also contributed an introduction and commentary. Making Waves is distributed by our partners at the University of Texas Press. Making Waves features edited transcripts of 21 of Thorne Dreyer's interviews with a wide range of guests on his RAG radio program. That program is broadcast on Austin's KOOP radio station. The interviews include not only the transcripts of the actual interviews themselves, but Thorne has added some really interesting commentary to all of them. Recently, Thorne donated to the Briscoe Center a complete collection of his audio interviews that he conducted on his RAG radio program. His archive relates to a wide range of collections here at the Briscoe Center, including the Abby Hoffman papers, the Texas Observer archives, the papers of John Henry Falk, civil rights leader James Farmer, journalist Molly Ivins, as well as a complete collection of the Space City News, an underground newspaper in Houston, and the collections of Thorne's SDS colleagues, Alice Embry and Dee Gorton, among many others that relate to the things that Thorne has been involved in. The Briscoe Center occasionally publishes books that are largely based on our collections. Making Waves is the latest book in our series. Before I welcome Thorne, I want to share just a tiny bit of his biography here for you. Thorne Dreyer is a native of Houston, Texas. He attended the University of Texas at Austin in the 1960s, where he joined the Students for a Democratic Society, better known as SDS. While at UT, Thorne became heavily involved in the civil rights and anti-Vietnam War movements. He also helped create and edit the underground newspaper, The Rag. He returned to Houston, his hometown, after he left the University of Texas. And when he was there in Houston, he helped create and edit the famed underground newspaper, Space City News. After leaving the underground newspaper world, Thorne ran a public relations business, and he wrote for Texas Monthly magazine, among many other endeavors. All the while, he remained active as a political and social justice activist. He returned to Houston in 2006, and 3 years later, Thorne started his radio program, RAG Radio. I want to welcome you, Thorne, to the program. And also, I want to thank you very much for doing this book and for your donation of your archive to the center. It's a very valuable collection for us. So thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's an honor to do this with you.
So, you know, Thorne, and I'm going to read a little bit from your introduction, your beautifully written introduction, by the way. But in the introduction to Making Waves, you state that the interviews, quote, I'm quoting here, shine a light on my personal history and interests. And you're talking about the interviews themselves. Before we talk about this wonderful book, let's talk a bit about your personal history, because it's clear that your personal history is relevant to what, why you've edited this book and your interviews. So tell us a little bit about, I do know I went to graduate school in Houston, as you know, and I knew more about you then than you knew about me, since you didn't know anything about me at all. But Thorne was quite a well-known person in the underground sort of counterculture world in Houston, in the Montrose area in particular, when I was in graduate school, but we never met personally. So, but anyway, talking about your background, your parents were both well-known personalities in Houston. And I met and interviewed your father, Martin Dreyer, who was a journalist, and he was with the Houston Chronicle. Right. I interviewed him for my book, Red Scare, about McCarthyism in the 50s. He helped me a lot in his interview. And I know your mother was well-known, too. So tell us just a little bit about your parents and growing up in Houston.
Well, it was a rarefied environment that I grew up in. My father, like you said, was a newspaper man. He was also a creative writer. He taught creative writing, and was very much a humanist. He wasn't a leftist particularly, but he was very much a humanist, and became more of a leftist as I think I influenced my parents. My mother was a leading Houston artist who won many awards in many shows, had one-woman shows. When she died way too young, there was a posthumous show at the Contemporary Arts Museum in Houston and a retrospective at St. Thomas University. They were the center of a scene of artists and writers and bohemians and intellectuals. They had an art gallery, Dreyer Galleries, and it was the setting for these gatherings that happened fairly regularly, often on the occasion of an exhibition starting. And so I was always, even as a young boy, was always around this kind of environment. And I got to know a whole lot of people that were their friends or that were artists and writers and whatever. They had a gallery that showed black artists, that showed young women artists, and a lot of artists from South and Central America, in addition to Houston and state artists. So
they had a very progressive reputation.
So they had a progressive reputation. And in fact, later on, when we were publishing Space City, this other underground newspaper, and Abby Hoffman was coming to town, and the Klan suddenly reemerged. The Klan in Houston reemerged, and instead of black people, instead of African Americans, they were attacking us and other anti-war activists. They shot up my mother's gallery. They shot up the Space City office. They shot up they bombed our and shot up the windows of some of our advertisers. So, and they painted a hammer and sickle on the front of my mother's art gallery. So they were really just trying to scare us, I think. If they had wanted to do personal harm, they could have very easily. But so it was always a kind of lightning rod. The people, and I don't know how much it had to do with me and my involvement in SDS and everything, but it actually had started before that when you think about it. Because
do you recall when you first sort of developed some sort of social consciousness, sort of a political progressive consciousness?
Well, I think that even when I was in school, I was always, and I went to this sort of more progressive schools in Houston. I went to Bel Air High School, and I went to the Mark Twain and Pershing Elementaries and school at Pershing Junior High, and it was always there, and my parents were always were very progressive, and I think I picked up on it, and then I got to know a lot of people at these events, and so it just was in my blood.
So there was never an aha moment.
There was not an aha moment.
We just wake up. Oh, wait a minute, this is all wrong or something. I mean, it just came naturally.
No, I started going to the Unitarian Fellowship, which had. They had speakers instead of ministers, and they were mostly progressive, and I went there for a while. So and in high school I got into theater. I studied acting in New York too, by the way, and a lot of the people at Bel Air there was a big community of people who I would call very progressive. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And
so you left Houston and went to come here to the University of Texas at Austin as a student, And what was the university like? Do you remember what year was it approximately when you came here as a freshman, do you recall?
64, I guess.
64,
I graduated from high school in 63, but I went to New York first.
Okay.
So I came back, I guess it was 64.
So what was the place like in 64?
Oh, it was Nirvana in the hills. It was wonderful.
Nirvana in the hills.
Yeah, it was a great place. It was so different from what it is now. And you know, it's a sort of saying among people in Austin, I think, that, oh, Austin was great 10 years ago. Oh, yeah, well, you should have been here 10 years before that.
Right.
You know, I mean,
or 20 or 30.
20, because there was a real academic environment. The school has become more of a commuter school. There was, you know, and they've built up all of these, they've created all this stuff on the campus that makes it harder for people to get together. And
it was smaller school.
Done away with the student union. It was a smaller school.
Yeah.
But there wasn't the big division between students and non-students. People would go to school for 10 years, you know, in and out. And now they'd be sweeping you off the campus.
That's true. That's true. So what did you study? What was your
I studied
major?
Acting, and I also...
Oh, you came here as an acting student.
I came here, but I also studied just liberal sciences, liberal arts.
Well, how did you get started? How did the rag newspaper get started then?
Well, the Daily Texan had always been a sort of beacon at UT. It won lots of national awards. It always had progressive editors. And this one year in 65, I don't know, 65, this guy named John Economity was elected editor of the Daily Texan. And Economity was a right-winger. He was a ROTC major, I think.
That's ROTC?
ROTC. And I believe that's what, I mean, I don't know if there was such a thing as a ROTC major, but that's what he seemed like.
I just want to make sure no one thinks you're saying Roxy, like Roxy Music. Anyway, ROTC, yeah.
So he was elected. One of the things he campaigned on was no more liberal girl editors.
No more liberal girl editors.
Yeah, okay. The previous editor had been Kay Northcott.
Oh my gosh.
Who actually wrote the story in the first rag, the cover story in the first rag, talking about Economity. When he first came into the Texan office, he had this makeshift swagger stick. He went to the middle of the room. He slammed the swagger stick on a desk and said, "General John is here." So it was off and running. Well, we were already very involved in SDS. SDS had already been going on campus for a couple of years, and I was involved before the RAG. And we had already thought that the next step that we needed to take was to start a newspaper. The RAG was not actually an SDS paper, but it was SDS people that generated it.
I see, yeah.
So,
but what were you trying to accomplish with it?
We were pro-civil rights. We were against the war in Vietnam. We believed, and this is a general thing about the underground press too, is that a lot of stuff that was very important wasn't being covered by the mainstream media, or the establishment media, as I guess we called it then. That we, you know, and we presented the news in a more subjective way, because we thought that there's no such thing as objectivity in reality, that it has to do with who owns the medium, as to who decides what's objective news. And so a lot of things. We were all involved in social action, and so we thought that we needed to have an outlet for what we were doing.
Well, what was your reaction? Did the university administration have any reaction to the RAG?
Yeah, they tried to keep us from selling it on campus. And it was, in fact, they took it, it was taken all the way to the Supreme Court. And David Richards, Ann Richards, who had been Ann Richards' husband, took it to the Supreme Court, and we won. It wasn't a landmark decision, but we won, and we were allowed to keep selling the paper on campus. So that was a big thing. when the first issue came out, it sold out immediately. People were just, I mean, it just went like hotcakes.
So you weren't giving it away?
We weren't giving it away. It was like 20 cents or something. So.
Well, what kind of impact other than, I mean, that's a huge impact taking and going all the way to the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
I mean, the newspaper itself had
Right.
had a major impact. You think it had much of an impact on the student body?
I think it absolutely did. One of the things about the rag was that the rag, one of our ideas was that there was this big counterculture community in Austin. And there was also a big New Left community. And we wanted to try to bring those groups together and make them into a political force. And I think we were very, very successful at doing that. And we got, the paper always had a lot of humor, it had a lot of art. It had some of the best of the underground comics artists, like Gilbert Shelton, who did the fabulous Furry Freak Brothers, which were right up there among the very most cherished of the underground comics.
Was Robert Crumb one of them?
Was Crumb and Shelton were probably the two most famous. So anyway, so we created, we had a lot of humor, and so it started to break down barriers. The other thing we did was we did a thing called Gentle Thursday, and Gentle Thursday we announced with signs and whatever all over the campus that next Thursday is going to be a day to be gentle, a day to bring your babies to campus, bring your dogs to campus, kiss somebody on Gentle Thursday, paint flowers on the sidewalks, all this kind of very hippy-dippy kind of thing.
How was that received?
It was very big turnout, and a lot of the fraternity people came.
Oh, okay.
And so that was one of the things we wanted to do. And so the administration banned Gentle Thursday. And once they banned Gentle Thursday, it became a massive event.
Of course.
And it helped, I think, to transform the University of Texas campus. And the RAG was the primary pusher of Gentle Thursday.
Well, I want to go back a second. You mentioned something about you wanted to try to bring the counterculture and the New Left together.
Right.
Just briefly, if you can, tell our viewers what the difference was between the counterculture and the New Left, and so that you had to bring them together. They weren't the same.
Especially in other places, in the East and in the Midwest, they were really almost in opposition to each other. The New Left people thought that they were wasting time, that they were frivolous, because of all of the sort of the countercultural activities that tended to be funny, and theater tended to be things like throwing money out of the stock down to the floor.
Like Abby Hoffman.
Well, Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin and the Yippies,
right.
But there were a lot of other people like that, the White Panthers.
So you consider them more counterculture than New Left?
They were more counterculture, but for us, Austin was always a little of each. Austin was always,
right.
And so it just blended together in Austin pretty well.
Well, so when did the RAG quit being published?
The RAG lasted 11 years.
All right. But you left before.
I left before that, yeah.
And you went
The RAG
back.
was one of the longest lasting of the underground papers.
I see.
And it was the sixth of the underground. There ended up being probably 1,000 of them, of underground papers. They were just everywhere. They were on Army bases, GI bases. They were on in high schools, in communes.
So since you left the university and moved back to Houston, correct? Or did you move someplace? I mean, is that when you moved back to Houston? Well,
before I moved back to Houston, I worked with Liberation News Service in New York.
Okay.
Also known as LNS. And it was a news service for all the underground and underground newspapers and alternative radio stations and progressive outlets of all sorts. And so that was another very interesting experience. So I did that for about a year, and then it was in New York, which is where the LNS was, that several of us came together and decided that we were going to go back to Houston and start a paper.
Okay, so then that's the Space City.
That's how we came up with it.
Didn't it have two different names, like Space City and then Space
It was
City News?
originally Space City News.
Okay.
It was Space City News for, I think, I don't remember, 12 issues or something like
12
that.
issues or so, something.
I think. And the reason we had to change it was that we were sued by a UFO group.
A UFO, like an
unidentified flying objects. So they had a little sheet called Space City News, and we didn't want to get on the wrong side of the aliens. So,
so that's when you changed it.
So that's when we changed the name to Space City with an exclamation mark.
So how long was Space City published in Houston? How long? What was its lifespan?
It was not as long. It was 3 or 4 years.
That's right. Okay. Yeah.
And
it also, I recall, this is when I was in Houston,
but it did a whole lot in those 3 or 4 years.
Yes, it did. Yeah. I know everybody that I was in graduate school with read it. Who saw it. So. You also had a program on Houston's Pacifica Radio.
Yes.
During this time when you were with Space City, right? Or with those?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, it was called the Briar Patch.
The Briar Patch.
Thorne, Dreyer, and the Briar Patch.
Okay.
Oh, please don't throw me in the Briar Patch.
Oh, okay. All right. So is this when the Klan blew up your radio transmitter?
It was the Klan actually blew up the transmitter before I was working full time.
Oh, okay. So it wasn't your fault.
It wasn't my fault. I didn't. It was not a reaction to me necessarily. I don't know. But they blew it up twice. They blew the transmitter up twice, and it's the only radio station in the history of this country that's had its transmitter blown off the air.
And its transmitter wasn't it in Pasadena, Texas? Seems like I remember it was in Pasadena.
It was somewhere. I don't.
Someplace out there.
Maybe it was in Pasadena. I don't remember for sure.
Well.
But, so it didn't hurt anybody. It just took the station off the air.
You got a lot of national press.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Civil War in Houston, Newsweek wrote.
That's right. Yeah. Well, let's talk about making waves.
Okay.
So this is as I said earlier, your selection and editing of interviews that you did on Rag Radio.
Right.
And
I've done about 500.
Yeah. So you had to. I know when we first started talking about you doing this book, you had the tremendous job of trying to identify something like 20 or 21 interviews, something like that. I mean, in fact, actually, there are 25 people you interviewed,
right,
and you did it in 21 interviews.
Right.
A couple of them were
2 on.
Yeah, and so you had to select those that you wanted in this book.
Right.
Well, wait a minute. Let's go back at first. How did you even get the program going? How did you? It's on radio station KOOP.
Yeah, KOOP is an all-volunteer, cooperatively run radio station, and it is the only cooperatively run radio station, as far as I've been able to learn, in the country.
Oh, really?
So it's actually run by all the people who work there, and everybody who works there is a volunteer. Everybody who works there has to do volunteer work. They have to do a certain amount of volunteer work every month. So it's
like a collective.
It is. It's like a collective.
Interesting.
But they call themselves a co-op.
And I suppose it's listener supported, as they say.
Listener supported, yeah, and it has a pretty big following, and it has all kinds of programming. But the programming is designed to some extent to be stuff that you aren't going to find anywhere else on the radio dial, at least in Austin.
How do you hear it? I mean, how does a listener? Where do you guys? Is it AM, FM?
It's on FM, 91.7 FM, and it's also streamed at koop.org. And then our shows, the Rag Radio shows, have all been put up at the Internet Archive. So every show we've ever done is archived, and so you can go back and listen to all the shows. That's
the Internet Archive. So you can also listen live on streaming, right?
Oh yeah. When it's streaming.
Yeah, on your computer.
Right.
Yeah. So anyway, so you linked up with KOOP.
Mm-hmm. And boy, a friend of mine was working over there, and he came and talked to us, and he was sort of sympathetic to SDS and to what we were doing. And he said, you ought to do a show on co-op. And you have to go through a whole training process, and you go through you have to go through an apprenticeship. And so then I got the show. And in fact, I came on normally there's 2 seasons when they bring in new shows, but they brought me in almost immediately because another show left. Oh. And so we had I think a good following immediately.
So when you started this program, Thorne, what was your purpose?
Well, it was one thing we wanted to do was to talk about history, to talk about Austin history, to talk about the history of the 60s, which we think people these days don't know much about. Mm-hmm. And also just cutting edge and socially conscious programming stuff. It didn't have to be history. And we also had musicians and talked to the musicians and had them perform. So we've done a whole lot of different stuff, a lot of artists, a lot of authors,
So what criteria did you use when you were selecting the interviews to be put in? Because you had a huge number of interviews you had
to choose from. Well, I tried to get a variety. I tried to get people that were all kind of cutting edge in one way or another. They weren't all political. Some were artists. Right. Some were musicians. Some were sort of like groundbreaking activists. We have Tom Hayden, who was one of the founders of SDS and is considered to have been probably the most important of the 60s activists. And he wrote the Port Huron Statement for SDS, which was an incredible mission statement. So anyway, we have him, and then we had Bob Daddy O. Wade, who's was part of the Cosmic Cowboy movement, but also did these incredible monumental-sized sculptures. Like he did an iguana that was on the top of the Fifth Avenue, on top of one of the Lone Star Cafe, and they actually sued him to try to get him to take it down because they didn't think it was art.
Well, see, that's what I think is one of the strengths and really for potential readers, the attractiveness of this is because your interviews, you interviewed such a wide range of different kind of people, and it cuts across popular culture and politics and everything. And I think you did a fantastic job of selecting this, combination. I mean, the Rathers, Dan and Robin Rather, Dan's daughter. Yeah. I think that's a good example.
Oh, that was probably my favorite interview.
Is that your favorite interview?
I mean, there's a lot of them that I really liked but Dan is such a gentleman. He's such a sweetheart. Yes. I mean, he's very funny, and so I had him and his daughter, tell us about Robin. Robin, who is an environmental activist and an environmental consultant, and was on the board of the Save Our Springs movement. So she came out. It was the first time that the two of them had ever done an interview together.
I knew that. That's interesting.
Yeah, and so we talked about a whole lot of stuff. But this is the kind of thing we did with the show that I've often done with the show. Is we started talking about when Dan Rather was announcing minor league baseball games and
the Houston Buffs.
The Houston Buffs,
yeah.
And which I used to listen to him do, and they recreated.
Right.
They did recreation. So he was standing there with the teletype, and reading what happened. So and so single to left field, and so he would say, "Oh, sharply hit ball." Blah, blah, blah. And I said, "Did anybody ever mess up?" And he said, "Oh yeah, people messed up all the time." He said that the teletype guy might have been drinking an adult beverage and he missed something, and so he said that somebody had to walk to first, but they didn't or whatever, and so he had to do a, I don't remember.
Well, he had to either
It's
get
not
somebody
important.
on first or get them off, one of the two.
Yeah,
I mean, Dan did. Making it up. I mean,
Right.
Yeah.
So, which was funny, and he was a real good sport to talk about that, and I think he enjoyed it. He enjoys everything he's done. And so
well, it's a great discussion about the hurricane, about his experience in Hurricane Carla.
Hurricane
also,
Carla,
really good.
and that was where CBS actually discovered him.
That's right.
But
going back to Robin a second, so
Yeah.
she's an environmentalist, and that's the first time the two of them had actually appeared together,
Right.
in an appearance, something like that. And that's the strength of this book.
they had some differences too. It was neat because she thought Austin was in much worse shape than Dan did. Dan says, "Oh, it's going to work out."
Dan's an optimist anyway.
Dan is the optimist,
Yeah.
and she is the pessimist. So anyway, so it was fun.
Well, so you also had you had Bernie Sanders on.
Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about that.
That was done over the phone. He was in Congress, and I don't know if he was on the floor of Congress, but he was in the Capitol building, and that was right before he announced his first run for president, and it was 2 weeks before he was coming to Austin to do a town meeting.
I see.
He presented a lot of his positions that hadn't really been heard yet before, because he was just now, cutting his teeth in the political, not in the political realm. He's certainly been doing that for a long time.
No, but he was kind of under
campaign.
the radar as a socialist independent in the Senate. He also, then you've got things like for old Austinites, the Armadillo World Headquarters founder Eddie Wilson, an interview with him.
Eddie Wilson is always fun. He started Armadillo World Headquarters. He was one of the founders of Armadillo World Headquarters, but he ran it, and then he also had Threadgills afterwards. And one of the great things about my interview with him was that he told us about Bruce Springsteen. When Bruce Springsteen first came to Austin, it was his first trip through the South. And he had been to Houston, but everywhere else he had been received poorly. He didn't, and so he was very nervous. And in the interview, it says that he was just walking up and down the side of the stage and didn't know what was going to happen. And Alvin Crowe was opening for him. And Alvin Crowe, of course, was this, he didn't know how an audience that would respond to the Western swing of Alvin Crowe would respond to him.
Yeah.
But people were standing up on tables, supposedly standing up on the bar, throwing their hats in the air to the extent they had hats. So, I mean, he went over great. So,
that's great. We have the archives of the Armadillo World Headquarters here at the Briscoe Center. And we have the contract that Bruce Springsteen signed for that first concert, that first performance that he played, at the World Headquarters. And one of the addenda that he placed on the contract was that there was to be several cases of iced cold Coors beer behind, there for them to drink. And this is back in the day when Coors really wasn't distributed in Texas.
Right.
And so I found the notes in the archive that they had to bring it in and so forth. But well, you also interviewed, you've had what some people believe are fairly controversial people on your program, and you've got a very interesting transcript of interviews with Bill Ayers and Bernadine Dorn.
Right.
Of the underground, of the Weather Underground.
Right, who are good friends.
Who are good friends of yours. Tell us a little bit about your relationship with them.
Well, one thing is that, of course, that's 50 years ago that the Weather Underground, I guess it was about 50 years ago. And they
both had to go underground.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But then they both became highly respected academics. Bernadine was a clinical professor at Northwestern University, founding director of the Children and Family Justice Center at Northwestern. Bill Ayers was a distinguished professor of education and a senior university scholar at the University of Illinois at Chicago. They're highly respected in the academic field, and they're also very, very thoughtful and not crazy radical in their approach to social change.
No, I know they're very well respected as intellectuals and teachers, educators. Did you get any negative feedback from putting them on the air with you?
Not really.
Have you ever had any negative feedback on interviews in terms of someone being too controversial or?
I sure have.
That's great.
I'm sure there has been, but I just can't remember.
So did you, of the interviews that you had, do any in particular stand out as that you were surprised at how well it turned out, or that you went better than you would have expected, or?
Well, I did an interview with Pete Gershon.
So tell us about him.
Pete Gershon is an art historian in Houston, but he now runs the Orange Show, which is
What's getting an outdoor exhibit around a house?
It's got a train that goes around it.
Yeah,
It was built by this man who was an untrained artist. He built this wonderful space, and unfortunately he died before he finished and before people, because he thought it was going to be the eighth wonder of the world or something, or ninth wonder of the world, whatever, after the astronome.
After the astronome.
Right. But it was very interesting.
Pete's interview, you mean?
So Pete talked about he had a book called Collision, which was about how contemporary art hit Houston in the 70s and 80s.
Oh.
And it was a collision.
That's the collision.
It was a collision. And the story is like an adventure story. I mean, it includes...
Oh, it's a good interview. Really
it includes floods, fires, a fight. It was wild and woolly. He said that, people used to they would go to a bar and they would end up in a fist fight. I don't remember that myself.
Well, it's a fascinating interview. It's a good choice to put in the book.
Yeah, I really enjoyed him, and I enjoyed the one. This one opening, and you can that they had with an artist named Miranda who did things with food. He would color food, or he would do things that was around healthy eating or different stuff. And so it was his art, and he did all of these loaves of bread that were these bright colors. And the Kilgore Rangerettes suddenly came out with these, they put a big table in the middle of the cam, and they came out with these platters of red and blue and green and yellow bread, and they put them down. And so the museum was actually divided into two halves by these tables with this bread. And suddenly people started grabbing pieces of bread and throwing it around at each other. and then somebody threw a loaf of bread and hit a little girl. And some of the people from the cam went out and, as he put it, dealt with him, the guy who did it. So
it was the Wild West, wasn't it?
But it was the Wild West, and the night the cops came, and the evening ended with their sweeping up the blood on the floor.
Well,
it's interesting because it's the contrast of what you would expect at an art opening, and
particularly in those days.
Right.
Particularly in those days, yeah. Right. Well, the book is full of that stuff. Yeah. I mean, this is why it's so interesting to me. How do you think? Well, I should say, what do you hope people will take away from reading this book?
Everybody in that book has a vision, and they're really cutting edge in a lot of ways. I mean, it's very different. They have different lives. They have different experiences. They have different kind of art or different kind of politics, but it's mostly progressive. But it's edgy. They do interesting things, and
But that's the kind of thing that runs like a thread through the
through
book.
the book. Yeah.
How does this? How do you think this book, in any way, connects with where we are culturally and politically today? Does it at all? Do you think? Or is there any connection?
Oh, I think so. I think that it's very interesting for people now to look back at the things that have happened in the past. Some of it's very recent, but some of it dates back a few years, and it shows. It shows some of the creativity in terms of dealing with political situations.
Well, let me, one of the interviews you do is with Harry Hurt III.
Right.
Who's a very well-known author.
Yeah.
Was with Texas Monthly for quite a while.
Right.
And he wrote a big biography of Donald Trump before
Right.
Trump was elected president.
Trump's most hated biography.
Well, the interview that you did with Harry Hurt is fascinating. And some people might think, well, wait a minute, he did it in 2016, right before Trump was elected president. So this kind of dated and out of way. But it's not at all.
It's not dated in the least.
No, it's really good.
Yeah. And he talks about the time that he and the publisher, they were trying to sue them. Trump was, although he didn't have any real basis for suing them, and so they were all meeting at the lawyer's office, and so they discovered that Trump announces that he's been taping the whole meeting, and the lawyer
He's been taping the whole meeting.
He'd been taping,
Okay.
which he wasn't supposed to do, and so he went stomping out of the place. And it's an interesting thing because so many of these people actually I knew at one point or another.
Oh, I know. You can tell that in the conversation.
Harry Hurt, I was in his first wedding.
And Al Reinert is in here.
Al and Reinert we were very close friends. I first met Dan Rather when I was a kid because Dan Rather worked briefly at the Houston Chronicle.
Right.
When my father was there.
That's right.
And so I met him up at the press club or somewhere, and I met him a few times over the years. But
well, see, it's this personal connection, I think,
right,
that really enriches the interviews.
Right. Dan Rather, he didn't hold his job at the Chronicle very long. As he said on our show, he said that he couldn't spell. He was a terrible speller. And they suddenly said, well, maybe you'll work on the radio side. And the rest, of course, is history.
That's a kind of a play on, well, you've got a face that's great for radio.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, Thorne, let me just make a kind of a closing comment here for those prospective readers that we have out there that we certainly hope will take advantage of this really fascinating book, really well done book. But I say, in your book, you write, and this is a quote, that you like to know and interview people doing significant work in this world. I like to visit with interesting folks, and I never discourage laughter. I always tell my guests, we're going to record some important history here, but we also want to have fun, unquote. I think the readers of Making Waves, just like the listeners of Rag Radio, are going to learn some important history when they read your book. Well, they're also going to have a lot of fun. Yeah. So thanks, Thorne. I appreciate you doing the book for us, and I thank you so much for putting your collection here.
Well, thank you so much.